Was Christ really chewing on bread? Seriously? Let's dive into a world of medieval theological wrestling matches, where popes issued edicts, philosophers argued about God's digestive system, and a seemingly simple question: what happens when you eat Holy Communion nearly tore Christendom apart. Forget dusty tomes and complicated jargon. This is a story of stubborn minds, frantic scribes, and a surprisingly messy debate about the very nature of God. It all started with a guy named Berengar of Tours. A Benedictine monk, a brilliant thinker, and according to some accounts, a bit of a worrywart. He'd been pondering the Eucharist, the central sacrament of Christianity, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of literally eating Christ's body and blood. He wasn't saying it was a bad idea, mind you, just a weird one. His concerns weren't about sin or spiritual nourishment, but about the sheer physicality of it all. If Christ's body is broken and chewed, he'd argued, doesn't that mean it's also digested? Doesn't that mean it's, well, you know, waste? Now, this wasn't a casual observation. Medieval theologians were obsessed with the practical implications of faith. Everything had to make sense, had to align with logic and observable reality. And the idea of God's body being processed through a human digestive system, it was deeply unsettling. Think about it, fasting rules demanded an empty stomach, a clean slate for receiving the Eucharist. If the body was being broken down, what was the point, and what about the sick? Those struggling with indigestion were deemed unfit to receive, and the thought of vomiting up the consecrated host was a serious offense. Then there were the animals. Mice scavenging for crumbs near the altar suddenly became a theological problem. What if a mouse eats a piece of consecrated bread? Someone asked, and the ensuing debate was truly epic. Was the mouse now part of Christ? Was it guilty of sacrilege? The thought of burning a mouse for consuming the Eucharist wasn't exactly a peaceful solution. And let's not forget the unbaptized, the penitent, the truly unworthy. Could they genuinely partake in the body of Christ if they were, well, a little bit messy? Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, a man with a reputation for being incredibly blunt, decided to put Berengar on the spot. He essentially issued an ultimatum: deny the literal consumption of Christ's body or face excommunication. The resulting decree, known as Ego Berengarius, which roughly translates to I, Berengar, was a shockingly literal interpretation of Berengar's concerns. It stated in excruciating detail that the bread and wine on the altar were indeed broken and chewed by the faithful. Priests were instructed to break the body as they would a stick, and the faithful were to tear and swallow it as they would a piece of meat. You can imagine the reaction. Lanfranc, a brilliant and fiercely intelligent Archbishop of Canterbury, was appalled. He saw it as a grotesque distortion of the Eucharist, a reduction of the divine to a purely physical act. Berengar himself was horrified, desperately trying to backtrack to salvage his reputation. He argued that the bread and wine remained as the body and blood, even as they were consumed. It was a brilliant, if somewhat convoluted, attempt to reconcile the literal with the spiritual. Enter Ockham, a 14th-century Franciscan friar and one of the most influential thinkers in the history of philosophy. Ockham wasn't interested in grand theological pronouncements. He was a pragmatist, a logician, a master of dissecting arguments. He tackled the problem of the Eucharist with a cool, detached precision. He argued that the sacraments are essentially signs, symbols pointing to a deeper reality. Baptism isn't being baptized, it's the act of baptism. Confirmation isn't being confirmed, it's the performance of confirmation. Similarly, receiving the Eucharist isn't becoming part of Christ's body, it's the act of receiving it, a symbolic gesture of union with Christ. Ockham's approach was revolutionary. He essentially shifted the focus from the substance of the bread and wine to the act of receiving. It was a subtle but profound change, and it paved the way for a more flexible understanding of the Eucharist. He didn't deny the real presence of Christ, but he refused to get bogged down in the messy details of digestion and consumption. Now, this wasn't the end of the story. Other theologians like Scotus offered their own solutions. Scotus, a brilliant and deeply mystical thinker, proposed the concept of impanation, literally, breading. He argued that in the moment of consecration, the bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ, not in a literal, physical sense, but in a metaphysical one. It was like taking a piece of wood and transforming it into a sculpture. The wood remains wood, but it now represents something entirely different. Think about it, Aristotle's philosophy, the dominant intellectual framework of the time, dealt with natures. Every individual thing had a specific nature. A plant had the nature of being a plant. A human had the nature of being human. Scotus argued that God, being purely divine, didn't have a human nature. But Christ, as God incarnate, did have a human nature. And in the moment of consecration, Christ's divine nature somehow breaded his human nature, transforming it into the bread and wine we see on the altar. It's a mind-bending concept, isn't it? It's like saying that God, in a moment of divine creativity, took the essence of Christ and wrapped it in the form of bread. The debate raged for centuries, with theologians and philosophers offering increasingly complex and nuanced arguments. Aquinas, a towering figure in Catholic theology, eventually settled on a compromise: transubstantiation. This theory held that while the appearance of the bread and wine remained the same, their substance, their very essence, was completely transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Transubstantiation neatly addressed the concerns raised by Berengar and Humbert. It explained how Christ could be truly present in the Eucharist without being literally broken or chewed. It preserved the integrity of the bread and wine while simultaneously affirming the real presence of Christ. It was a brilliant, elegant solution, but it also relied on a complex understanding of metaphysics, a field of philosophy that was still in its infancy. But the practical implications of this debate weren't just intellectual. It had a profound impact on the daily lives of Christians. The insistence on an empty stomach for receiving the Eucharist led to strict fasting rules. The fear of unworthy reception, of receiving the sacrament while in a state of sin, led to elaborate rituals of self-examination and confession. The whole process was designed to ensure that the Eucharist was received with the utmost reverence and seriousness, and let's not forget the visual aspect. The insistence on retaining the species, the outward appearance of the bread and wine, was a deliberate attempt to prevent the Eucharist from becoming too alien, too unsettling. It was a way of reassuring the faithful that they were receiving the same bread and wine they had seen on the altar, even as they were transformed into the body and blood of Christ. The story of the Eucharist isn't just about theology, it's about human nature. It's about our desire to understand the divine, our struggle to reconcile faith and reason, and our need for rituals and symbols to make the sacred tangible. It's a story of stubborn minds, frantic scribes, and a surprisingly messy debate about the very nature of God. So, the next time you receive Holy Communion, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of theological debate that have shaped this central act of Christian worship. Remember Berengar's concerns, Ockham's logic, Scotus's mysticism, and Aquinas' compromise. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities and the beauty of faith. But seriously, did God really chew on bread?